In the silence of her room, Katisha gazed down at her small, barely 10-year-old palms. With a deep sigh, she caught herself thinking how her current physical weakness was becoming a stumbling block in her desire to help. She, with her delicate and small hands, even a simple action like wringing a towel was given with great difficulty. The thought made her heart fill with sadness and longing for the powers she missed so much. Pensively gazing into the space of her room, she let her thoughts drift far into the future. In her dreams, Katisha saw herself as grown up, strong, and independent. In her mind, she was not only grown up, but also had the strength that would allow her to be a reliable support for her grandfather. Grandpa, who was growing weaker by the day, needed her help more than ever. Katisha dreamed of the day when she could lend him her shoulder, when she could lighten his burden and bring more joy and ease into their home. These reflections filled her soul not only with sadness, but also with strong determination. She realized that time was inexorable, but she also believed that each new day brought her closer to the time when she would be able to fully care for her grandfather. Despite her current weakness, Katisha was full of hope and faith in a future where she would become the strong and caring granddaughter she dreamed of being. With an affectionate gesture filled with care, Katisha carefully placed the damp cloth on her grandfather's forehead, trying to ease his suffering. At that moment, her thoughts were smoothly transported back in time to the days when she first realized that her destiny was inextricably linked to an unusual rebirth. 5 years ago, Katisha discovered the shocking truth about her existence, which was drastically different from the life of an ordinary girl named Katisha Ainsley. She remembered how, at one point in her life, she realized that she had previously been a completely different person whose life had been cut short by a tragic car accident. It was a revelation that turned her understanding of reality upside down. When she awoke from her death, she found herself not just in a new body, but in a completely different world, a world that had previously existed only in the pages of a novel she had once read. This world was filled with adventure, magic, and mystery, but Katisha found herself playing the role of a simple girl, a character who was never mentioned in the central plot lines of that story. In becoming Katisha, she did not become a heroine of great feats or tragic events written in a book. Instead, her life was now humble, filled with simple joys and caring for her loved ones. And despite all the hardships and challenges she faced, Katisha felt a deep sense of gratitude and satisfaction with her new life, especially since she had previously been a poor orphan. This unexpected change of fortune gave her a unique opportunity to start anew, to enjoy every day and appreciate the moments of happiness that this life offered her. 10 years ago, Katisha's story took an unexpected turn when she was left on the doorstep of her grandfather's house. Being a man with a big heart and an open soul, he could not leave the little girl without care and attention. He accepted her as his own granddaughter and took it upon himself to care for her, teaching her about life and sharing his wisdom with her. Katisha, growing up surrounded by her loving grandfather, only later realized what difficulties and trials he had to overcome to raise his granddaughter alone. Life in their small but cozy home was filled not only with warmth and care, but also with constant chores and household chores that fell on the girl's shoulders from an early age. Grandfather, striving to teach Katisha independence and responsibility, forced her to constantly help around the house, fostering in her a sense of duty and diligence. Although these responsibilities sometimes seemed burdensome to Katisha, she gradually began to realize their importance. The difficulties she faced in doing her homework helped her to develop persistence and perseverance. Katisha's grandfather found the strength to turn to her despite struggling with each breath that seemed harder and harder to give. The weakness of his voice and difficulty breathing could not hide the care and excitement he felt, even at the edge of his strength. Katisha, standing nearby, answered him with unwavering certainty that his letter had been sent. She realized that this letter most likely contained her grandfather's will, a document whose existence she had guessed from observing his concern for the future. With sadness in her heart, Katisha noted that in the entire week since the letter had been sent, there had been no word of response from her grandfather's relatives. Her heart was filled with bitterness and resentment at the realization of the indifference with which they had treated her grandfather's illness. She couldn't understand how blood relatives could be so indifferent to the condition of a family member who needed support and involvement more than ever. Despite all the pain and frustration that enveloped Katisha, seeing the insensitivity and lack of response from her family, her grandfather found the strength to smile at her. His heart was filled with gratitude and joy that he had Katisha, his granddaughter, by his side, who had not left him alone in these last hours. His eyes reflected a deep appreciation for her devotion, care, and love that had become his support and comfort as he entered the sunset of his life. Katisha's heart was filled with anxiety and despair as she stood at her grandfather's bedside and begged him to stay with her. Her words were full of hope, a silent desire to experience many more happy moments together. She recalled the warm promise he had once made to her about a festival they were to go to together. Pictures of the two of them sledding together, laughing and hugging, enjoying every moment of joy and fun, hovered in her dreams. Those moments promised to be the epitome of their shared joys, a symbol of carefree happiness. But instead of happy plans for the future, Grandpa, with deep sadness in his voice, spoke of the inevitable. He admitted that his days were numbered and that the time they could spend together was diminishing inexorably with each passing day. This confession was said with such longing and regret that Katisha's heart clenched with pain. Grandfather noted that Katisha, absorbed in dreams of adventures together, did not think at all about life without his presence. He told her that he had already prepared everything for when he wasn't around, trying to comfort her with the thought that he cared about her future until the very end. With those words, Grandpa slowly closed his eyes, as if trying to rest from the weight of the emotions he was feeling. For Katisha, it was a moment filled with deep despair and at the same time love for this man she held dear. She realized that every moment spent together was priceless, and that every word of her grandfather's, his every look and smile, would be kept in her heart forever as a reminder of the unbreakable bond that death could not break. At the dawn of a new day, when the sun was just beginning to break through the dense cloud cover, enveloping the world in a warm, gentle light, an event occurred that left an indelible mark on Katisha's heart. At this moment, while the earth still held the morning chill and the air was filled with the odor of freshness, the funeral took place. Katisha, whose heart was shielded by a heavy shroud of sadness, left flowers on her grandfather's coffin with gratitude in her heart. Her gratitude was addressed to her neighbors, those unnoticed heroes of her everyday life who did not hesitate to come to the rescue in a difficult moment, helping with the funeral. The gesture was simple but extremely important to Katisha, symbolizing farewell and at the same time gratitude for the years they had lived together, for the moments of joy and sorrow they had shared as one. After the farewell ceremony, when the last words had been spoken and the silent mourning had subsided, Katisha was alone amidst the deserted silence of the cemetery. She realized that she was now facing a new stage of life, a journey that would have to be taken all alone, without the support and guidance of her grandfather. The thought of a future without his wise counsel and kind smiles made her heart clench with pain and uncertainty. But suddenly, as if fate itself had decided to intervene in her musings, breaking the silence, she heard a voice that brought into her world not only attention but a suggestion that could change her life dramatically. That voice belonged to a young man who introduced himself as Duke Vlasco's accountant. His name was Jamian Parker, and he had apparently appeared for a reason. That meeting look with the stranger, whose appearance was so sudden, seemed to herald the beginning of something new and perhaps decisive in her life. And here stands Katisha, against the backdrop of the passing day, looking into the face of the man who has just entered her life, unknowingly from where, but perhaps carrying the key to new doors, behind which uncharted paths of the future await her. The moment Jamian Parker, a representative of the Vlasco family, entered into dialogue with Katisha, a shroud of bewilderment and shock enveloped her mind. The Vlasco family was known not only for their nobility and power, but also for the dark pages of history that surrounded the last Duke of the Empire. It was like a whirlwind bursting out of the pages of historical novels to be here, amidst Katisha's gray everyday life, turning her view of the world upside down. Jamian, with impenetrable calm, pulled a document from his briefcase like a key opening a door to another reality. He pointed to an entry in the will that stated an unusual request. The coffin of Katisha's grandfather should be moved to the Duchy of Vlasco. She had never imagined that her grandfather, a simple and unassuming man in her mind, was actually the Duke of Vlasco. Memories of her grandfather began to flash through her mind. His stories, his demeanor, those rare moments when he seemed absent, immersed in his thoughts. All this time, he seemed to have been hiding a deep secret, a truth about his past that was now weighing heavily on Katisha's shoulders. With this discovery, she faced not only the mystery of her family's past, but also questions about her own destiny and place in a world where the boundaries between mere existence and noble descent were blurring, leaving her to face an unknown future. What other secrets did the pages of her family history hold? And what will Katisha face now that she's confronted with a legacy she had no idea existed? As Jamie and Parker's words gained weight in the air, Katisha felt the reality around her begin to slowly but inevitably change. Opening the page of the will where her name was written in black and white, Jemayan opened before Katisha a world full of not only wealth and power, but also unseen opportunities. As if from the depths of the past, Duke Vlasco's last will was paving the way for a future in which Katisha played a key role. At that moment, images of vast territories, beautiful palaces, works of art that she could only dream of, and business empires that were now to be managed flashed before her mind's eye. All this splendor and wealth described in the will turned her vision of the future upside down in an instant. At the age of just 10, Katisha finds herself on the threshold of a new life where she is a millionaire and potentially a billionaire. Mixed feelings swept over her as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. Amazement mixed with disbelief at her luck. How could she, a mere girl, become the sole heiress to such a vast fortune? The thought that she was now to enter a world where she would not only have wealth, but the responsibility of using it made her heart beat faster. Jamian offering to go to the duchy to start the inheritance process was like opening the door to a new reality for Katisha. In his proposal sounded not only the possibility of realizing the last will of Duke Vlasco, but also an invitation to the beginning of a completely new life, full of challenges and discoveries. Katisha wondered. But as soon as Jamian mentioned that this was what the new Duke of Vlasco would want, Katisha remembered something. At the heart of the plot, where intrigue and passions are boiling no nonsense, stands on its own rails the story of Vlasco, the newly minted duke, whose swordsmanship was unrivaled. However, his unrivaled skills were overshadowed by his extremely unpleasant character. In the eyes of the author of the novel, Vlasco was the antagonist who knew no equal in his cruelty and rejection of the world around him, so much so that he did not even consider his own adopted daughter worthy of human attention. Katisha, with her fierce will and independence, had initially rejected the thought of going to the Duke. She had no intention of becoming a part of his world, a world full of neglect and coldness. But things took an unexpected turn when Jamian reminded Katisha of her inheritance. A sum sufficient to change any beliefs, $1 million in cash and $100,000 a year in addition. These figures sounded like music to my ears, promising a carefree life and financial independence. Katisha, despite her initial position and her attempts to prove otherwise, felt tempted deep down. Her assurances that money couldn't buy her were beginning to lose credibility. And so, as Jamian continued talking about the subject, a spark of amusement lit up in his eyes at the realization of how easily material goods could change someone's resolve. In the end, Katisha gave in. Her agreement was a moment of irony and victory for Jamian, who was easily able to dispel her doubts, turning a serious moment of choice into a cause for laughter and levity. The moment Jemayan, with a slight smile on his lips, revealed to Katisha the exciting news that she would be the owner of a magnificent mansion in the heart of the capital, the atmosphere around sparkled with anticipation. His words flashed a fire of joy in her eyes, causing a wave of glee to come over her with incredible force. This moment was a source of genuine happiness for Katisha, enveloping her in a warm feeling of anticipation of a new, fabulous chapter in her life. However, in this euphoria, Jamian, without losing his playfulness and the slyness in his eyes, reminded Katisha of an important condition. With a smile full of secret intentions, he clarified that in order to make her dream a reality and truly become a full owner of this majestic mansion, Katisha would need to travel to the duchy. When Jamian turned to look at Katisha after his unexpected announcement, he found that she, without wasting a second, was already fully prepared for the journey. Immersed in deep thought, Katisha, nestled in the soft cushions of the carriage, slowly rolled along the roads leading to her new destiny. On this journey, enveloped by the light rustle of wheels and the rhythmic clatter of horses, she was immersed in reflections on that mysterious and exciting process of inheritance which was soon to touch her life. Katisha's thoughts smoothly intertwined with memories of recent conversations with Jamian, who, like a key to the secrets of the past, opened the door to the world of ancient customs and beliefs of their family. With a special thrill in her heart, she recalled the moment when Jamian had mentioned the hero spirit, a mysterious and powerful entity that was the cornerstone of inheritance traditions in their family. Jamian, like a guide to the world of unexplored truths, explained to Katisha that his words about the holy soul referred to the soul of the previous head of the family, which did not leave the boundaries of the duchy even after death. This soul, he said, shrouded in the aura of great ancestors, had the extraordinary ability to maintain the illusion of conversation with the living, blurring the line between past and present. Such a revelation brought a mixture of admiration and involuntary awe to Katisha's heart, causing her to ponder the depth of the connection she was soon to make to the history of her family. Hundreds of springs ago, in an era shrouded in legend and mystery, the first head of a great family engaged in a battle with the forces of darkness that culminated in his victory over the Demon King himself. This epic duel left behind not only pages in the history books, but also tangible evidence of the greatness and magic of the race. A sword in which the essence of the Demon King himself was sealed. From that moment, the sword became not just a relic, but a sacred duty of the Vlasco family, who carefully kept it, protecting it from the gaze of foes and time. As part of the ancient agreement made between the first head of the clan and the Demon King, the latter was subject to the will of the head of the clan. But this power had its price. When the head of the family died, he gave up his soul, which became part of the invisible fabric of the duchy. Thus, the soul of each departed head continued to exist within the ancestral domain, keeping in touch with the living and protecting them. This fact took on a special meaning for Katisha, because it meant that the soul of her grandfather, the dead head of the family, continued to reside in the duchy. This prospect filled Katisha's heart not only with awe and excitement, but also with a sense of deep connection to a past that could now become part of her own life, opening up new vistas of understanding and interacting with her ancestral heritage. The moment Katisha realized that the invisible presence of her grandfather's soul was now hovering around her, awakening from its long oblivion, she was immersed in thoughts of her own kind. Her heart was filled with the deep realization that she was not alone in this world, even despite her seeming isolation from her bloodline. These reflections led her to the memory of the one time her grandfather had opened the veil of secrecy about his past by telling her about his sons. With bitterness and heaviness in her heart, she remembered the words of her grandfather, who had confessed that he had once been the father of 2 sons. One of those lives had been cut short too soon, leaving only a painful echo of loss in her grandfather's soul. The other son, as family legend had it, was such a complex nature that even the ties of blood could not outweigh the magnitude of his actions and decisions. This difficult fate led his grandfather to eventually disown him and go to live in seclusion, in the depths of silence where he could find peace for his tortured soul. The moment Jamian revealed to Katisha the unexpected truth that the newly minted duke's only inheritance was only a title, without any lands or wealth, Katisha felt as if she was under attack. This discovery forced her to rethink her own place in the situation, to think about her prospects and possibilities within the new reality in which she found herself. In these musings, she involuntarily recalled the novel's protagonist, Neil, who had been adopted by Vlasco's family. Neela's story was full of tragedy, as she was treated extremely cruelly as an unwanted stepchild, disenfranchised and disempowered. All of Neela's attempts to gain support and respect in the family, as well as her dreams of becoming the head of the family and changing attitudes towards herself, have been shattered by the rock of indifference and hostility. This inability to overcome prejudice and find her place in the family led to Neela being forced to leave her family walls. She was to go on her wanderings seeking help from the white cult, hoping for support and understanding from them. Upon arriving at the white cult's hideout, Neela found an unexpected ally in the person of Ikal, a mysterious figure with not only a deep knowledge of demonic artifacts, but also the ability to manipulate forces hidden from ordinary view. This encounter awakened in Neela a new hope and determination in her quest to conquer the demonic sword, a symbol of power and might that could radically change her situation and give her the strength for new accomplishments. However, the story of Neela and Ikal breaks off at the most interesting point, leaving a heavy sense of uncertainty and many unanswered questions. This unfinished twist of fate for the characters became a source of anxiety for Katisha, who, inspired by Neela's example, found herself facing her own trials at Vlasco Manor, not knowing exactly what fate had prepared for her. Katisha, realizing that her bond with the Velasco clan was not backed by shared blood, prepared to face the same hostility and disdain that Neela had once endured. Memories of the insults hurled at Neela within the walls of the manor hovered in the air, reminding Katisha of the difficult path ahead of her. Katisha felt unspeakable anxiety as she pondered her future in Duke Velasco's castle. Her heart was full of anxiety. She feared that the Duke, on learning of her presence, would not hesitate to throw her out, or perhaps take even more drastic action. In this whirlwind of doubts and fears, she found the strength to turn to Jamien with a question that kept her on her toes. Looking forward to meeting her grandfather's spirit, Katisha sought solace in the thought of her upcoming conversation with him, hoping to find answers to her many questions and perhaps receive his wise counsel. Jamien, with his knowledge of the mysterious processes involved in summoning spirits, replied to Katisha that it would take at least 2 or 3 months for the soul to stabilize. These words fell on Katisha like a thunderclap, plunging her into deeper despair. She was convinced that Duke Velasco would detect her presence in the castle long before she could contact her grandfather's spirit. The thought tormented her, making her heart beat in time with each passing second, each of which seemed like a step toward her inevitable fate. The Velasco family had a passion not only for power, but also for the violent battles that had been their hallmark for generations. This family, which bore a proud name, has long been known not only for its indomitable thirst for battle, but also for its amazing entrepreneurial spirit. Several generations ago, Velasco's ancestors made a strategic decision to invest heavily in fossil development and alchemy research. These ambitious endeavors were extremely successful, providing the family not only with new sources of income, but also greatly expanding their influence in political circles. As Velasco's wealth grew, their power became more and more powerful, to the point where even the emperor himself was unable to limit their influence or oppose their authority. Katisha, once inside Velasco's estate, could not hide her admiration for its splendor and luxury. Every corner of the place, every detail of the interior seemed to her to embody the luxury and power of a family that had amassed its wealth and influence over the centuries. It was impossible to take one's eyes off the ornate halls, majestic architecture, and exquisite works of art that adorned the estate. This place was a vivid testament to the greatness and power of the Velasco family, and Katisha, immersed in the atmosphere of incomparable splendor, felt herself part of something great and significant, even if only for a moment. Katisha was worried when faced with the prospect of losing the inheritance she was about to receive. Deep down, she still harbored the hope that at the very least, she would be able to keep a home filled with warm memories of her time with her grandfather. These thoughts swirled in her head as she was finally led to Duke Velasco, the man on whose decision her future depended. Upon meeting the Duke, Katisha was struck by his appearance. The Duke's predatory gaze met hers, assessing her from head to toe. His eyes were amazingly beautiful, the rich sapphire hues that characterized all members of the Velasco family. Those eyes seemed to penetrate her, seeking to unravel her nature and intentions. The Duke's appearance, a combination of nobility and irresistible strength, left Katisha indifferent, a mixture of admiration and anxiety. Her thoughts were interrupted by Duke Velasco's commanding voice as he referred to her as the foolish child, for whom so much fuss had been made. Those words, spoken with disdain and authority, made Katisha feel even more insignificant before his power. Nevertheless, gathering all her courage, Katisha formally introduced herself to the Duke, trying to maintain her dignity in this difficult situation. This moment was a test for her, in which she had to prove her fortitude in the face of Duke Velasco's unyielding authority. Katisha, standing before Duke Velasco, in expectation of reciprocation, assumed that he too, following etiquette, would respond to her with a bow. To her surprise and disappointment, however, the Duke showed no desire to follow this custom, remaining steadfast in his dignity and authority. This moment created an atmosphere of extreme awkwardness between them, making the air around them dense with unspoken words and unshared social gestures. Katisha, feeling the Duke's heavy gaze on her, fell into a state of panic at his silence. Her heart pounded frantically and her thoughts raced, searching for a way to diffuse the tension. The silence felt like an eternity, a burden that grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, interrupting this lingering silence, the Duke turned to Katisha to ask her age. His reaction to her answer was instantaneous and expressed genuine surprise. Upon learning that Katisha was only a 10-year-old girl, he didn't hide his defeat. Something flashed in his eyes that could be interpreted as a reinterpretation of his perception of Katisha, comparing her to a dried orange. Receiving a command from Duke Vlasco to approach, Katisha hesitantly began her journey towards him. Every step she took was full of doubt and internal questions about how far away from him she should stop, so as not to violate the invisible boundaries of respect and submission. Her movements were slow and careful, as if she were stepping over the invisible barriers that separated their worlds. When Duke Vlasco called her a sly fox, there was more than curiosity in his voice. It was like recognizing the exceptionality of the moment when he encountered an unusual individual capable of arousing his interest. At his command, Jemayan helped Katisha take a seat on the table so that she was at the Duke's eye level, setting the stage for a closer encounter. When Katisha was on the table, Duke Vlasco came close to her, staring at her with his piercing gaze. He scrutinized her as if he were searching for answers to secret questions posed to his own mind. At this moment, a tense atmosphere of evaluation and re-evaluation hovered between them, where every moment seemed laden with significance. After a thorough examination of Katisha, the Duke concluded that she was definitely not a child of the Vlasco family. The Duke, a man of impressive status and power, brought a touch of absurdity to the situation by asking him if Katisha was an orange. The moment made the air in the room seem to freeze as if waiting for an answer. Jemayan, not giving in to the provocation, did not answer directly to such an unexpected question. Instead, he chose the path of a storyteller, opening the curtain on Katisha's story, which had begun in a rather unusual way. He told of how a baby girl named Katisha had once been found under the door of the Duke's past. A small medallion lay beside her, as if to indicate her origin, or at least her history. The current Duke, listening to the story, suddenly declared the tragedy of his father's inability to care for the child. This confession revealed to Katisha the dark truth about the complicated relationship between her family and the ducal household. The realization that her grandfather and the Duke were on strained terms came to her with renewed vigor, especially when the Duke looked angrily at Katisha as if emphasizing every word he said. The look was full of unspoken accusations and the heavy history that had weighed heavily on their relationship. Jemayan approached Katisha with a question that might reveal new facets of their story. He wondered if there were others in Katisha's life who could be considered her family. Katisha, as if deep in thought, briefly shook her head, making it clear that she had no other family. At that moment, she thought about the cryptic words of her grandfather, who had once said to her, "If you clean well, I'll leave you the house." These words made her wonder if they were a hint that she might be entitled to an inheritance. Jemayan, listening to her, could not hide his bewilderment at the strange will of the previous Duke, who seemed to have left Katisha nothing tangible, but nevertheless listed her as the sole heir. In this context, Jemayan asked another question regarding the sword, an object that could have both symbolic and practical significance to their family. However, Katisha admitted that she knew nothing about the sword, thus adding another mystery to the existing ones. A sudden turn in their conversation came when the Duke, looking intently at Katisha, asked her an unexpected question. He wanted to know if the name Gerst was familiar to her. Like a bolt of lightning cutting through the silence, that question sent Katisha into a storm of emotion. The name Gerst was no ordinary name. It was the name of a demon king, a creature shrouded in legend and dark secrets, a name that should not have been familiar to an innocent soul like Katisha. She suddenly felt herself facing something unknown and forbidden, realizing that her knowledge of that name could plunge her into a deep vortex of events from which there would be no return. Her mind began to whirl as she realized that she had encountered something far beyond her understanding and possible experience. Without giving her time to ponder, the Duke continued, asking the next, even more direct question about whether Katisha had inherited Vlasco's relic. Katisha, feeling the Duke's gaze on her, full of anticipation and tension, hastily shook her head, trying to deny any connection to the relic that might bring more questions and possibly danger upon her. In handing Katisha a copy of the will, the Duke was not just giving her news of the inheritance. He was giving her a challenge that could radically change her entire life. The document stated in black and white that Katisha would not only inherit the famous Gerst relic, but would also become the head of the Vlasco family. This discovery was a real shock to her. The burden of responsibility for the entire clan, on top of the power the relic provided, was too much for a young girl whose life up to that point had turned out very differently. The Duke's strict demand for an opinion on the situation only added to the pressure. Katisha, who found herself in the epicenter of attention and expectation, could not contain her emotions. The tears that rolled down her cheeks were not merely expressions of fear or uncertainty, they symbolized the overload of the sudden weight of fate that she was to carry. She felt like a small boat caught in a storm of great events and decisions that were required of her. In the midst of the emotional whirlwind, as the atmosphere in the room reached boiling point, the Duke, seized by a surge of anger and frustration, suddenly exclaimed that he should have been the one to shed tears. His words sounded like a thunderclap, for he had, in his opinion, the most to lose by not receiving even the title of head of the family, which he believed was rightfully his. This outburst of despair and resentment illuminated for a moment the depths of his inner feelings. Jamien, always faithful to his duty and friends, tried to calm the Duke, but his attempts were only met with a new wave of anger. The Duke accused him of betrayal, of siding with Katisha. However, in spite of all the attacks, Jamien remained steadfast in his position, emphasizing that Katisha's grace and mercy were undeniable values that deserved recognition and respect. And then, when it seemed that the quarrel could go on forever, something unexpected happened. It was as if a wind of change blew into the room, instantly dispelling the tension. The Duke, as if coming to his senses after a long delirium, suddenly agreed with Jamien. Perhaps the sincerity and openness with which Jamien spoke reminded the Duke that the true strength of a leader lay not in titles and power, but in the ability to see and appreciate the goodness in others. With that sudden realization, the Duke ordered Katisha and Jamien to leave the room. Left alone, he may have sought solitude to rethink what had happened, or perhaps to come to terms with the new reality of Katisha becoming the head of the family. Jamien, sensing the gravity of the moment and wanting to support Katisha, decided to escort her to her room. This gesture of support was a reminder to Katisha that despite all the difficulties and challenges, she is not alone. Jamien, with an impenetrable expression on his face, placed the pouch heavily in Katisha's hands. It seemed ordinary at first glance, filled to the brim, but the weight of it told a different story. Katisha turned the pouch over in her hands with slight bewilderment, assessing its contents. Her thoughts swirled in a dance of guesses and assumptions until she untied the drawstring and peered inside. Her eyes widened in amazement when she found 50 shiny gold coins there. It was a fortune she could only dream of, and now it lay in her hands, heavy and tangible. But Jamien didn't stop there. His next gesture was to hand Katisha a medallion made with exquisite grace. This item was not just a piece of jewelry, but the key to something grand. Jamien explained that the medallion served as a pass to the vault of the central bank, a place better guarded than a fortress, a place where even the thought of entering without such permission seemed insane. This medallion not only confirmed Katisha's status in their unusual alliance, but also opened doors before her that could hide untold treasures or secrets that could change the course of history. After the initial excitement of the unexpected gifts had subsided a bit, Jamien turned to Katisha with a reminder that brought a new note of confidence to her heart. He emphasized that now, being in her new status, she had the right and ability to demand help from the servants who surrounded them in this majestic but mysterious place. Jamien mentioned the Duke as a man that, despite his strictness and unapproachability, also possesses a kindness capable of showing genuine care and support. These words inspired Katisha, filling her with renewed strength and determination to face any challenges that might come her way. When Jamien left the room, leaving Katisha alone with her thoughts and feelings, she slowly walked to the bed and lay down, sinking into thought. The thought swirled in her mind that being the heir to the Gerst sword was not only an honor, but also an incredibly heavy burden. This sword, with its immense power and magical properties, could cause its wielder to lose control of himself and become like a demon, a creature devoid of humanity and reason. Katisha realized that she would not only have to learn how to handle this powerful weapon, but also how to deal with its influence to prevent an unfortunate outcome. These thoughts kept her on her toes, making her think about many things, including her own fate, which seemed to have been predetermined from the moment she accepted the sword into her hands. She remembered her grandfather, a man with an indomitable spirit and a mighty character who, despite all the difficulties, was able to live a long life. Unlike him, Katisha felt that she didn't have the strength to handle even the first test, the ceremony of receiving the sword. Doubt and fear for her future tormented her seemingly without end, wrapping her heart in the cold anticipation of the inevitable. The approach of morning brought no relief, but only increased the sense of grave inevitability. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, Katisha did not hesitate to go to the Duke to express her decision. Standing before him, she gathered all her remaining resolve and declared her intention to relinquish her inheritance of the Gerst sword, reasoning that she felt unable to bear such a burden. However, the Duke's reaction was unexpected. He firmly stated that it was impossible to refuse the inheritance because the will made by the previous Duke had been certified by the Magic Bureau. This meant that the decision to hand over the sword was not only recorded as the will of the deceased, but also as a legal obligation, backed by magical seals and spells, which Katisha had no right to undo. The moment the Duke tore the document to shreds while demonstrating his point, Katisha felt a surge of hope for a moment. Her expectations were cruelly shattered, however, when pieces of paper, as if by magic, fluttered into the air and began to come together to form the original document once again. The Duke, observing her reaction, emphasized the impossibility of destroying the document, thus confirming its magical nature and the inevitability of Katisha's destiny. In the face of such an immutable reality, Katisha, feeling the pressure of circumstances, offered a compromise solution. She expressed her willingness to accept the Gerst sword, but on the condition that she could then pass it on to someone else. However, the Duke, like a cold shower, cooled her hopes, explaining that the condition for the transfer of the sword was the death of its previous owner. This revelation came as a shock to Katisha. She realized that the sword of Gerst was inextricably linked to the fate of its owner, and that her attempts to avoid what was destined for her only confirmed the inevitability of accepting this powerful but also very dangerous inheritance. His eyes, full of determination, stared into the space in front of him, and the words of the order hung in the air like an invisible weight. Katisha, whose heart was pounding in her chest with fear and uncertainty, felt her fate hanging in the balance. She was afraid that her end was imminent, and that the only solution was for the Duke to take her life. In a desperate attempt to prove her worth, Katisha began listing her skills, trying to convince the Duke of her need. Her voice trembled as she spoke of her ability to create delicate swan figures out of apples, hoping it would impress and change her fate. However, the Duke, whose interests and preferences were far from the culinary arts, found nothing in these words that could interest him. His reaction was lightning fast and merciless. Katisha was dismissed. His eyes did not reflect an ounce of admiration or even simple pleasure at the girl's skill. With the ease typical of a man accustomed to giving orders, he informed Katisha that she would be given a test that would determine her fate. The Duke's words, marked by coldness and indifference, were the herald of new trials for Katisha. With sadness in her heart and a heavy weight on her soul, Katisha slowly left the hall, her footsteps echoing in the long, empty corridor, the walls of which were witnesses to many fates and mysteries. The path along the corridor seemed endless to her, each step reminding her of the uncertainty of what lay ahead. In the back of her mind, she prayed for a favorable outcome, but the silent walls of the castle seemed indifferent to her hopes and fears. Lying in her room, surrounded by a silence that seemed almost tangible, she was deep in thought. The thought, heavy and dark in her heart, was that perhaps her grandfather hated her. How else could she explain the inheritance of the Gerst sword? This ancient symbol of family honor and greatness, somehow in her hands, seemed not so much a gift as a curse or a test. Thoughts of her parents knocked softly but insistently in her mind. What kind of people were they? What dreams and hopes had they put into that sword, passing it down through the generations? As she tried to find answers, she felt an acute lack of information about her roots, which only increased her sense of loneliness. In the midst of this flood of thoughts, a longing for her grandfather suddenly flashed through her mind. Memories of him, the rare but vivid moments they'd spent together, suddenly came alive in her mind, causing a powerful surge of emotion. Trying to hold back tears, she felt grief and love mixing together to create an indescribable swirl of emotions. It was hard to admit that despite all the hardships and trials brought on by this inheritance, she still sought in it a piece of her grandfather's warmth, his wisdom, and perhaps a hidden blessing. These moments of reflection, full of sadness and longing for the past, became for her a kind of bridge connecting the past and the present, helping her to better understand herself and her place in a long chain of generations. each of which left behind something important, putting family values, hopes, and expectations into these symbols. Suddenly, at the most unexpected moment, the locket that Katisha was wearing lit up with light, making her heart freeze in wonder. Radiating a glow, growing brighter with each passing moment, the locket unfolded before her as if opening a door to another world. This sudden burst of light and energy wrenched a cry out of Katisha, a mixture of surprise and consternation. The next moment was even more disorienting for her. Katisha found herself unable to determine where she was. There was impenetrable darkness all around, only faintly diffused by the light coming from the medallion. Looking around, trying to figure out her location, she started tapping on the nearest surface, which turned out to be a wooden wall. The sound, muffled and hard, brought more questions to the situation. Suddenly, to her utter amazement, the wall seemed to respond to her knocking and began to slowly open. The light that penetrated revealed that Katisha was inside the box. This discovery was so unexpected that the girl was speechless for a moment. She tried to collect her thoughts, trying to understand how she found herself in such a strange and incomprehensible situation. Katisha was faced with an interior that seemed to be taken from her distant past, from the life she had left behind. Everything around her, the laptop, the cozy chair, the folders with documents, seemed incredibly familiar and at the same time completely out of place in this new world she'd found herself in. In the center of this anachronism stood a typewriter, but not a simple one. A magical screen hovered next to it, which suddenly came to life, illuminating the room with a bright light. The screen, as if a being from another dimension, turned to Katisha to ask if she wished to continue. Katisha's agreement was instantaneous. She couldn't resist the urge to find out what was hidden next in this mysterious story. And then a surprising truth was revealed to her. She found herself on the pages of the 168th chapter of the novel, whereas according to her recollection, the last published chapter was the 167th. This discovery struck Katisha to the core. How was it possible? How could she be inside a story that hadn't even been written yet? This moment was a turning point for her. She realized that her journey was gaining new momentum, leading her down a path she had never dreamed of. Everything around me, from the laptop to the typewriter with the magic screen, now seemed to be part of some big, complex puzzle, a clue to unravel, and a bridge between two worlds. When Katisha decided to plunge into reading the continuation of the story, she was overcome with an inexpressible feeling of curiosity and excitement. Flipping through the pages, she remembered that her own name was not mentioned on any of them. This discovery made her heart beat faster, for she was confronted with a reality where she herself seemed to be but a shadow, hidden from the reader's eyes. Katisha's attention was drawn to the chapter where Neela, the protagonist of this thrilling epic, made a daring trek to the hero's spirit tower. Her goal was noble and clear, to get her hands on a sword that had the power to save Ikal, another important character in the story. Reading about Neela's courage and determination, Katisha couldn't contain her excitement. She wanted to jump for joy, seeing how luck had smiled on her heroine, how close she was to achieving her goal. However, that moment of joy was quickly replaced by the weight of realization. Katisha suddenly remembered that the enemies Neela had been fighting were now none other than Katisha's own relatives. This thought gave rise to mixed feelings in her heart. On the one hand, she was genuinely worried about Neela's successes and triumphs, but on the other hand, the feeling of being connected to the heroine's enemies made her soul unbalanced. Neela faced the last obstacle in her path, an imposing door that she assumed hid the purpose of her long and arduous journey. However, the guard at this final threshold turned out to be none other than Ikal, her old acquaintance, now consumed by the dark power of the demonic sword. Unrecognizable, with a fiery gleam in his eyes, he stood unwavering, like the embodiment of an ancient guardian guarding the entrance. Neela, coming face to face with such an unexpected protector, tried to find answers by questioning Ikal about the reasons for his transformation into a guardian. In response to her questions, Ikal only silently held out the document, shifting the conversation to a completely different topic. He asked her about Katisha Ainsley, whose name was obviously key to the situation. At this time, Katisha, being far away from the scene, got a real shock when her gaze fell on the last lines of the book she was reading. The entire previous plot had seemed like nothing more than the author's fantasy come to life that she had fallen into, but the mention of her own name in the final chapter turned her world upside down. The mix of reality and fiction raised a host of questions that she sought to find answers to. She began feverishly searching for the continuation of the story, poking at the magic screen in hopes of discovering a new chapter that might clarify how her name ended up in the novel and what it meant for her own fate. However, to her great disappointment, there were no additional pages. This moment was the beginning of her immersion into a mysterious world where the boundaries between reality and fiction became incredibly thin. Katisha felt completely lost in this room, as if the mundane walls around her had suddenly become an insurmountable maze with no way out. In despair, she turned her gaze to the unusual wooden box that seemed to be her last refuge of hope. With her heart pounding in anticipation of wonder or disappointment, she decided to surrender to her fate by returning to this primitive cocoon from where she thought her journey between worlds had begun. Carefully, with a shiver in her hands, Katisha settled into the box as if it were a coffin designed for crossing between dimensions. Her heart pounded with fear and hope as she closed the lid above her. The darkness inside the box was complete, and the silence was deafening. Only her own prayers for return, prayers to powers she hadn't even known existed until that moment, penetrated the silence. In this darkness, lying in the panic-stricken wooden womb, Katisha felt time and space begin to distort around her. With every beat of her heart, she expected the magic to come true, or for all her fears to go unrealized. And then suddenly, the unbelievable happened. A feeling of lightness filled her consciousness, and she felt herself being transported through uncharted dimensions. When Katisha opened her eyes, she found herself lying in her own bed, in a world that had previously existed for her only in the pages of a novel. Returning to this world full of wonders and dangers was both a joy and a challenge for her. She realized that her journey was not over yet, and that the challenges ahead promised to be even more mysterious and dangerous. After a night filled with many visits to the mysterious room where she sought answers to her questions, Katisha woke up feeling like her head was overflowing with information. Despite the lack of a new chapter she was so desperately looking for, she used the time to her advantage, rereading old chapters and picking up bits of information that had previously escaped her attention. In those pages, she found mention of the test the Duke had told her about, and now her understanding of events was much clearer. Soon there was to be a gathering of the clan, an important event that would bring together all the key figures and determine the future of their family. Katisha, as the heir to the legendary sword Gerst, was facing a qualifying test that would determine her place in the next chapter of the family's history. It was a test that would not only test her strength and skills, but would also be a deciding factor in her future destiny. In a novel that meant so much to Katisha, it was on this crucial day that the fate of Neela, a character with whom she felt an unexpectedly deep connection, was decided. Realizing this, Katisha realized that her own fate was also inextricably linked to the upcoming gathering. She felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, for the outcome of this meeting would determine not only her future, but the well-being of the entire family. Immersed in her reflections and analysis of past events, Katisha realized that her path was inevitably intertwined with Neela's fate. She had seen how hard Neela had prepared for her ordeal, overcoming hardships and obstacles to reach her goal. And now that Katisha was in a similar situation, she realized that in a way she had become her replacement in the plot of the novel. This realization brought a new charge of determination to her soul and spurred her to action. Once again traveling to the mysterious room, she once again immersed herself in the pages of the novel, searching for clues and explanations. Rereading the text, she discovered that Neela would not be due to appear in the story until 5 years later. The revelation was sudden and illuminating at the same time. Katisha realized that her role in history would be critical during this time. She had been appointed to replace Neela, to be the link between the past and the future in a saga that shaped the fates of many. Suddenly, however, when Katisha was fully immersed in reading and thinking, an unknown force threw her out of the room. She collapsed on the bed, stunned and confused by this unexpected turn of events. Once back in her room, Katisha realized that she now had a restriction. She could not return to the room with the novel for the next 6 hours. It was like a temporary exile that made her realize that interacting with the magic room and the novel had its own rules and restrictions that she could no longer ignore. This development has made Katisha rethink her attitude towards the task before her, especially considering that while Katisha is in that room, time in the novel stays where it is. She realized that every moment of time she spends in that world is important, and that any action or inaction she takes could have unpredictable consequences for the plot of the novel and her own fate. With this new realization, Katisha began to look for other ways to prepare for the upcoming ordeal, realizing that she had limited time before the clan meeting, and every minute counted. In the mysterious atmosphere of the last chapter of her story, where the mysteries were replaced one by one, Katisha pondered anxiously about the future of her relationship with Neela. Deep in her soul, she nursed a quiet hope that she could avoid the fate of becoming an enemy to Neela. In the dining room, where the sense of warmth and comfort mingled in the air, Katisha felt a very different emotion. She was enjoying the moment, savoring the beautiful scones that had been made especially for her. With warmth and tenderness in her voice, she mentioned that the scones reminded her of her grandfather, as if each piece held a piece of warm memories of him. However, there was a little trick behind those words. In fact, it was only an excuse, for Katisha wished to enjoy those buns for no other reason than her own pleasure. The cook, having heard of the memories associated with the past duke, took Katisha's words as the greatest praise of his skill. He stated that if his buns could resurrect such warm memories and connections to the past, then he owed it to himself to put even more effort into his culinary arts to continue pleasing Katisha. In the depths of the luxurious mansion, where every corner breathed history and grandeur, the duke was not without surprise to observe Katisha, who in his opinion showed a surprisingly valiant, as if she had long been the mistress of these vast halls and secret corridors. Her confident demeanor in such an imposing home prompted his comment that Katisha seemed too relaxed and dominant in his domain. Katisha, finding herself in the unexpectedly depressing atmosphere of this conversation, gathered her will into a fist and reminded the Duke of the will by which she could claim the house. Her words sounded tentative and forceful, for the prospect of owning such an estate was as sudden as it was frightening, but even so, she found the strength to express her rights. The Duke, catching the note of concern in her voice, could not hide his amazement at the speed with which Katisha had adapted to her new environment, and how quickly she had begun to feel part of this place. It was both an object of admiration and a cause for reflection. When Katisha, sensing the rising tension, decided to clarify whether she should be wary of the Duke, his answer was immediate and ambiguous. He assured her that he had never given her any reason to be afraid, while emphasizing her ability to adapt to any circumstance. And maybe he should take the money and chase Katisha away. This statement, on the one hand, was meant to reassure Katisha, but on the other, it left her facing uncertainty as to what the future held for her within these walls full of secrets and the impenetrable depth of the Duke's family history. In the atmosphere of the secluded dinner, where each meal became something more than just nourishment, the Duke, as if suddenly finding interest in the lives of previous generations of his family, turned to Katisha with an unexpected question. His voice sounded soft, but at the same time did not tolerate objections. He ordered her to eat and then, as if in passing, asked if the previous Duke, her grandfather, knew how to cook. Katisha, catching the unexpected note of personal interest in his voice, only nodded in response, confirming this unusual fact. This moment made the Duke think for a moment, as if his eyes flashed memories of times long past that had left a deep mark on his soul. He sank into the sadness that had suddenly overwhelmed his heart, but almost immediately, as if sobered, he dismissed the thoughts as if they might be a threat to his present tranquility. Trying to ease the tension that was beginning to build in the air, Katisha gently broached the subject of the past, mentioning that her grandfather had once told her about a fight with the Duke. This mention caused an instant reaction. The Duke's gaze instantly became malicious, as if the fire of long-standing grudges had suddenly flared up in his heart. Sensing that the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense, Katisha hurriedly changed the subject in an effort to soften the poignancy of the moment. She said that her grandfather, despite all his accomplishments and greatness, always seemed very lonely to her, lacking the support and understanding of his family. These words, though spoken with warmth and sympathy, left again in the air a sense of the elusive sadness and unresolved conflicts of the past, the echoes of which still echoed within the walls of this ancient house. In that moment, when the silence between the walls of the ancient castle seemed almost tangible, the Duke, as if under the heavy weight of long-ago memories, shared a piece of his past. He told Katisha about how his father, leaving the Vlasco family, including the Duke himself, had left behind a void that could not be filled with even the briefest of meetings or attempts to reconnect. This confession was made with such sincerity and pain that his words sounded like an echo of distant events, the echoes of which still echoed in his soul. Katisha listened attentively to the Duke and realized the deep connection between his words and her own past. She realized that her appearance in the Duke's life had a much greater meaning than it seemed at first glance. A realization dawned in her heart that the heavy burden she had borne because of her father's debts in a past life was, in its essence, similar to the same unfilled void of which the Duke had spoken. At the moment when the air was filled with the weight of unspoken words, the Duke let out a weary sigh. His words, filled with resignation, voiced the inevitable. There was no way to change what was happening. Katisha, whose agreement was expressed with a brief but powerful nod, found that the swirl of emotions triggered by the memories of the past were inexorably building up inside her, eager to break free. She was seized with rage as she pondered the burdensome legacy her father had left her, a debt of an astronomical 300 million, like a block of stone hanging over her life. This surge of emotion found its way into her words when Katisha, not holding back, began to talk about the revenge she wanted to exact on her father for all his transgressions. The Duke, however, was confused by this flow of passions, unable to grasp the depth and motives of her storm. But then, as if by magic, the incessant storm in Katisha's soul suddenly subsided. With a calmness unexpected by both of them, she pronounced that her path from here lay to the future, which would begin the moment the last question of inheritance was settled. This statement left the Duke in a state of amazement. Where did this fated ambition suddenly come from in a girl who seemed to be full of determination and energy? In the silence that enveloped them like a fog, Katisha opened her soul, allowing a glimpse into the deepest corners of her heart. She shared that her only dream had always been a home where she spent her happiest moments with her grandfather. The Duke, however, could not understand what could have attracted Katisha to this old 3-story building, which in his opinion looked more like a ruin than a house. In response to his bewilderment, Katisha reminded him with a smile that she planned to live there all alone, not with a crowd of 30 people, which immediately gave the image of the place a completely different, much more cozy and personal character. The Duke, hearing this, couldn't hold back his laughter. His reaction was so unexpected that it instantly diffused the situation. He noticed that Katisha did not seem to be afraid of him at all, which was rare among his acquaintances. Katisha, for her part, was struck by this reaction. For the first time she saw that the Duke was capable of joy and laughter, which was so far from the image of an unapproachable and always serious man she had previously formed. Katisha made an unexpected confession about life on the estate, saying that she was treated well there and that no one hurt her. The Duke was confused and dumbfounded by this statement. He couldn't even imagine why he would raise his hand against Katisha. With anger in his voice, he rushed to the questions, asking if her grandfather had ever hit Katisha, for such a thought seemed absurd to him. However, Katisha explained that she was referring to a very different man, her stepfather from her past life, a man who had caused her much pain and suffering. This conversation revealed to the Duke the depth of Katisha's experiences, her felt fears and past traumas. Katisha also admitted that she is even strange and unaccustomed to being treated kindly, and it makes her feel a certain fear. The Duke, in turn, was surprised by this revelation and hastened to assure Katisha that he would never allow himself to abuse children, and that kindness for him is not something out of the ordinary, but rather a norm of behavior. In a moment when Katisha was relieved after their frank conversation, the Duke shared a peculiarity about his family. He said the Vlasco family has a tradition of using tests to address a host of issues, including selecting candidates for various roles during family gatherings. This technique, according to the Duke, was almost a cornerstone of their traditions and rituals. However, as it turns out, a sideline of the Vlasco family took advantage of this practice in order to get rid of Katisha, planning to set her up to fail the test. Realizing that failing the test would mean immediate banishment from the estate, Katisha insisted that she be given another chance. Her desire to stay was twofold. On the one hand, she was anxious to complete some unresolved business connected with her grandfather's spirit, and on the other hand, she did not want to leave so soon a place that was beginning to become dear to her. With these thoughts in mind, Katisha firmly declared her intention to take the test, no matter what obstacles she had to overcome. This decision not only showed her tenacity and determination, but also astonished the Duke, who saw in her more and more not just a young person in a difficult situation, but a strong person, able to stand up for herself and fight for her place in the world. The Duke, Putting the seriousness and importance of the moment into his words explained to Katisha that the outcome of the test was largely determined by the opinion of the subject's immediate family. In her case, it was the Duke himself and his 2 children. This information made Katisha realize that the key to success lay in convincing the Duke's children to support her. If she managed to get their support, then all 3 of them would be able to significantly affect the overall mood of the meeting, giving Katisha a chance to not only start the test, but to pass it successfully. The Duke also shared an important nuance with Katisha. If she manages to hold off until her grandfather's spirit appears, they can change the will together, reassigning the Sword of Gerst to another person. This prospect inspired Katisha, for it gave her not only the opportunity to maintain her presence in the manor, but also to change her fate, and perhaps even the fate of the sword itself. Once again, when the majestic Duke expressed his desire to see Katisha eat, she did not object and immediately began her meal. Her actions were interrupted when the Duke, coming closer, suddenly and unexpectedly touched her cheek with his fingertip, causing Katisha to feel a wave of surprise and stunned. With an impenetrable gaze, the Duke shared his thoughts on how he was beginning to comprehend the depth of his father's feelings, who had once made the decision to concern himself with Katisha's fate. As he did so, he continued to playfully pull the girl's cheeks, not embarrassed by this action. The light of amusement flickered in his eyes when the Duke, unable to help himself, jokingly said that Katisha looked ugly. That moment made Katisha think. She couldn't help but think that there was something familiar about the Duke, something that reminded her of her grandfather. Her reflections on the Duke were imbued with a sense of deep connection, a sense that despite all the joking and playfulness, there was something more lurking in their relationship that united their destinies. As he left the room, the Duke dropped words filled with mysterious anticipation that soon, exactly 3 days later, his children would return. He emphasized that meeting them promised to be far less serene for Katisha than dealing with himself. This statement left Katisha at a loss, for she could not imagine how the Duke considered his behavior calm. His words, full of ambiguity and mystery, made her wonder about the trials ahead and what turn events might take after his descendants returned. Further, the Duke strongly advised Katisha not to engage in inheritance talks with anyone. This clarification added weight to his warning and shrouded Katisha's future in a halo of mystery and unpredictability. Left alone, Katisha plunged into thought. She pondered the Duke's words, trying to unravel their true meaning and foresee the trials she would face in the near future. An uneasiness mixed with curiosity grew in her heart as she imagined who these Duke's children were and exactly how her life would change once they arrived. The Duke's children, even against their imposing father, looked especially bright because of their extravagant natures. His daughter, who was particularly noted for her daring antics, one day without the slightest hesitation challenged Neela to a duel, purely for fun and a desire to taunt her. The Duke's son, for his part, always showed complete indifference to Neela, looking down at her from the height of his aristocratic serenity as if she were completely indifferent to him. Katisha, coming face to face with such different but equally complex characters, realized that showing her fear of them was the last thing to do. This realization made her gather her wits and show amazing courage and stamina, despite her youth and seeming fragility. Meanwhile, in his room, the Duke, immersed in thought, could not help but admire Katisha's courage. He thought about how, even at her young age of 10, she had the ability to do things that were admirable and the ability to do things that would have seemed impossible for her age. In particular, he was struck by her amazing ability to carve a graceful swan out of an apple, which was not only a demonstration of her fine motor skills and attention to detail, but also a reflection of her creative approach to life. In the depths of his mind, the Duke came to the conclusion that his father's decision to accept Katisha into their home was not without merit. As the head of the family, his word was law, and none of the family members would dare to openly object to his decisions, even if he decided to subject Katisha to a series of tests to test her strength. However, the Duke was curious as to how Katisha would be able to hold her ground and prove herself in front of Werner and Arnon, the 2 fierce personalities in their family circle. Thinking about it, the Duke could not escape the premonition that the situation might take an undesirable turn, and that Katisha's meeting with Werner and Arnon might turn out to be a serious ordeal for her. To prevent any trouble and to ensure Katisha's protection, he decided to take precautions. Jamian had to watch over her from the moment Werner and Arnon returned, to be ready to come to her aid at a moment's notice and ensure her safety within their domain. This decision of the Duke was driven not only by his duties as the head of the family to ensure the order and safety of all its members, but also by his personal concern for Katisha, who, despite her youth and apparent fragility, had already managed to gain his respect and sympathy thanks to her courage, resourcefulness, and unconventionality. As the days turned to waiting, and the silence of the manor was broken only by the sounds of nature and the mundane bustle of everyday life, a sharp and rumbling sound suddenly tore the air. The front door of the Duke's stately home swung open with such force that it seemed as if the wind itself had decided to rush in, bringing change with it. Katisha, frozen in place from surprise, quickly oriented herself and hurried to seek shelter. She chose the nearest wall where she could watch unobtrusively, barely breathing from excitement and nervous anticipation. As they crossed the threshold, Werner and Arnon entered the house, whose return heralded the beginning of a new and perhaps anxious period in the life of the estate. These two, already known for their colorful and ambiguous characters, instantly filled the space with their presence. Their footsteps sounded confident and heavy, as if each of them carried on their shoulders the invisible weight of power and self-confidence characteristic of true aristocrats.